Hi Jakub, thank you very much for your email about EKC, and I thought it'd be easier to answer by video rather than write an email. I probably would have written a second edition of the book by the time I've answered all your questions, but thanks very much for raising them. It's always useful and always interesting for me to talk about them. So I'll pause the video from time to time and then read a bit of your email and then answer the question off the top of my head, really. So let's start. So thanks for your feedback. I'm glad you found it useful, and your less positive feedback. Is the book easy to understand, easy to read, compatible with other sources, internally cohesive and again complete? Yeah, sure. There's first of all, our aim with the book was to give a summary of the body of knowledge in Kanban, or essential Kanban, so excluding certain parts of it anyway, so not necessarily going for completeness, but a broad brush of the whole of Kanban. It's not a complete explanation, and that means it's not that easy to read or understand, and the goal initially was to write another book which would have been probably maybe 10 times as long, not 10 times as long, but maybe 5 times as long, and would have explained more of it. Other priorities got in the way of that, and we didn't actually complete that book. But yeah, understand that it's not always easy to gather all the concepts in the very short space that we aim to do this book in. So fine. Is it compatible with other sources? I think it's probably best to pick up the ones that you've identified. Certainly there was an intention to update KMP I and II to reflect it. Some of that is done. Some of it is not compatible, and that's because Kanban has moved on, or because the authors of the course didn't necessarily agree with us on every point. So we'll come to those when you've raised with the ones you've raised. Internal cohesion I'm certainly interested in. We know there are some errors in the book, and at some stage we may do a second edition and then we can address some of these things. And completeness, as I say, we're not trying to go for the whole body of knowledge, but a broad body of knowledge, because it's really responding to people maybe think that Kanban is post-its on a wall, and when you grow up then you use Scrum or something like that. It's to show you that Kanban is a significant body of knowledge that needs study, and clearly in the 40 or 50 pages that we did on the method, there's not space to explain it all, but there is space to give you the scope of that body of knowledge. Okay, I'll pause. So your first point's on the scaling principles. There are no scaling principles in the book. That's true. I think it's interesting what the timing was in terms of when KMP II came out, or that slide in KMP II, and when the book came out. I think the book was written just before, but it's around that time that they were written, and we haven't, in a sense, we haven't resolved that inconsistency. What I would say, not necessarily what everyone says about this, but what I would say is that the scaling principles in KMP II are not principles; they're how to scale, and so that's to some extent that's a philosophical question about what's a principle and what's a step-by-step guide to do something. For example, static is a step-by-step guide for how to design a Kanban system. It gives you a set of numbered steps. It tells you this is what you do, and if you use it in accordance with the Kanban principles, the change management principles and the service delivery principles, then they're compatible. But static gives you a how-to list, and the principles give you the general principles underlying the philosophy of the method. So in that sense, I think the scaling principles, scale out, design each Kanban system with static, use Kanban cadences to improve and evolve, that's an example of a how-to. I've got more than one. How to start Kanban, start from here, visualize your work, improve incrementally. It's another sort of step-by-step guide of how to start Kanban, and so it's not quite in the same category as the principles, which are general philosophical background to the method. That's a philosophical point, and if we were doing a second edition, we'd resolve this in discussion with other people that maybe have a different view of what a principle is. Okay, so I teach KMP II, and obviously we cover the scaling principles. So that's not a problem. But if you, I think the reason they're not that's not compatible is just timing. Obviously, when you publish a book, it's a snapshot of views at that point, and the world moves on, and Kanban moves fast, which is a good thing. So, okay. So number 2, too many Kanban values. Good. I like your proposal to to group them differently. The point of the EKC is it summarises other people's work. In this case, Mike Burrows' work on Kanban from the inside, where he lists 9 principles and he goes through using those principles to explain the Kanban practices and principles. So it's an interesting point, values, and I think we would revisit it if we did a second edition. It may be more about what Kanban values rather than a fixed set of 9 principles or whatever. But the purpose of putting those in the book was to summarise what is, from the primary source, which is Mike Burrows' Kanban from the inside. He had 9 of them. That's why there's 9 of them in the book, and so we summarise them in there. No more than that. I think the discussion of values will go on. I think there are many other ways of looking at values. I think some of those come out in the Kanban maturity model and elsewhere. Clearly, if we did a second edition, there would be an update in that area. And your scheme is a good one. I think socialise that in the community, and no doubt in all these areas things will move on. Agenda maybe is slightly different. You say the agenda word is not intuitive. Yeah, that may be true. I think I would say the agendas in Kanban are very important, and the word is really what agenda do coaches have when they go into an assignment to apply Kanban. One view, which preceded the Kanban agendas, one view is, well, we don't have any agenda. We're there to solve the client's problem. The client tells us what the problem is. We apply the principles and practices of Kanban. If those are relevant to what the problem is, then that is what we're doing in Kanban coaching in that context. And if it depends how the client explains the problem as what our agenda is. Now, there's another view which also came out of that discussion, which is, well, actually, there's some general agendas which, in a sense, Kanban coaches need to have. And the first one of those is sustainability. You go in, you find too much work in progress, overburdened teams, and to address that agenda of we need teams that are motivated, that are seeing flow, that are seeing work completed, not overburdened by work being pushed on them at a rate that they can't complete. So that's an agenda in that sense of, there's a general agenda about the sustainability of work in a workplace, and Kanban addresses it. Similarly, the service agenda. Why does this organisation exist? Well, it's there to serve its customers and the users of its service. So that's the meaning of it, the survivability agenda, in terms of how do we look at organisations to ensure that they're fit for purpose and they are surviving and thriving in a competitive landscape. So that's why those agendas are there. That's the meaning of the word. So finding the right way to explain that in Polish, I think, is a good job in terms of how you translate it. But it is an agenda in the sense of, well, I'm coming with an agenda, and it's not an agenda to override what the client's agenda is, but it's to find where it fits in these general agendas of things that Kanban addresses within a service, and the staff working within a service, with the customer in terms of delivering a service to the customer, and with the organisation itself to ensure that it survives and thrives in a competitive landscape. Okay. So, why am I not surprised that the CFD and Little's law has appeared in your questions as well. Number 4, on the CFD, the real WIP is marked not approximated in average. You've written approximate average WIP are marked on the diagram. On the CFD diagram, the real WIP is marked, not average and not approximated on those dates. Okay, lead time and delivery rates are of course both average and approximate. So okay, so why does it say? So I've marked on the date you mentioned, the 2nd of the 11th or whatever, approximate average WIP, when what is actually marked as the distance between two lines, which is the actual WIP on that date. You're quite correct, it is the actual WIP on that date. What we're interested in Little's law is the relationship between average WIP, average delivery rate, and average lead time. And although we can see them roughly on this diagram, and then it makes sense that the gradient is the average delivery rate. Why are we doing it? So they are labelled quite carefully, and actually this was, I think, if you've got a very early version of the book, the labels are slightly different. So the gradient of the line is exactly the average delivery rate. It's not approximately the delivery rate, but it is that many items were delivered in that space of time, and you can see that. So the gradient of the line is exactly the average delivery rate. It's average delivery rate because we average over a period, and if you're talking about an instantaneous delivery rate, that's not really. You can do it every time an item is delivered. You can see how long before what we call CT1, the cycle time of the time between deliveries, not to be confused with other cycle times, but that the reciprocal of that is an instantaneous delivery rate. But it's not a terribly useful metric. We are usually looking at the number of items in a week, so the delivery rate over a week or the delivery rate over a month or whatever. So even the average delivery rate over a day, it's not instantaneous, it's the average over that day. So okay, so we have got the average, the gradient is the average delivery rate. Now the item which you said, why doesn't it just say WIP on the 27th? Well, it is the WIP on the 27th, but we can say for the purpose of this argument that the WIP on this day, or in fact any day in the period, is approximately the average delivery rate. And you can see from the graph that causes problems, because it's if the lines go up and down, it's not the average delivery rate. We have to, if we want to know what the average delivery rate is, we have to look at the average WIP. We have to look at the WIP every day and then average them. And depending on the granularity of the time units that you're using, but taking the WIP every day and averaging them, is important. That's how you do it to get an actual average delivery rate, average WIP. Sorry. So it's that line is only approximately the average WIP, and it's the same with the lead time. What we've marked is the time between the last item entering the system in this period and the last item being delivered, and the time between those two things might be, if everything was done in order, it might be the lead time of just that last item, but only if they were done in order. And so that's why it's approximate. And yes, we're interested in the average lead time. So can we show from this diagram? I'm doing a long explanation because this is potentially confusing to people. In the course, I wouldn't expect you to go into a lot of detail on this diagram, because it's sort of intuitive. We're trying to get an intuitive feel for why Little's law makes sense in our context, and also using the variables that we tend to use in Kanban. In other words, the average delivery rate is equal to the average WIP over the average lead time. And if you use that formulation of Little's law, then you need to qualify it, because that's not how Little formulated the law. He used average arrival rate, average wait time, and average average work in progress, so average number of items in the queue. So if we're using it in the useful form for us, the relationship between average delivery rate, average WIP and average lead time, then we can see it on a cumulative flow diagram. It sort of makes sense here, but you have to qualify it by saying these, well, it is the average delivery rate, but they're only approximately the average WIP and only approximately the average lead time. So that's why it's done sort of rather carefully. Maybe it causes more confusion because there isn't time to talk in KMP II or KMP I about a lot of detail of Little's Law, but that's why it's labelled that way. So so it's similar sort of thing. Okay, throughput, inconsistency on throughput. There is inconsistency in quite a number of the metrics that are used in Lean and flow systems and Kanban and other agile methods. So the classic one is cycle time, because by and large people use cycle time where I use time in progress or time in the part of the process that you're interested in, like time in development or time in test or time in analysis or whatever. So that to me is a more clear term, because we're specifying the part of the process that we're interested in and so on. So yeah, I can't get people to agree with me on what I prefer in terms of the names of the metrics. We need to understand what people mean when they say cycle time, or when they say throughput, or when they say delivery rate, or arrival rate, or discard rate. So when we wrote this book, what we're trying to do is, so if you change the formulation of Little's Law to use delivery rate rather than arrival rate, then you have to say, well, it's the average arrival rate is in a stable system is roughly the same as the average delivery rate. So we can make that link, but also we have to make sure that when you talk about the delivery rate, if there's a lot of items discarded during that process or abandoned, then or aborted, however you define those terms, then those items are not counted in the delivery rate. So delivery rate is clear, it's the number of items you've delivered. If there are some items that went into the system but went out some other means, by being discarded or aborted, whatever, then you have to include those if you want Little's Law to be correct, to be approximately correct. So that's why we use the term throughput, which again, if you look at some books, they talk about throughput rate. And what is throughput rate as opposed to throughput? Well, it's the same thing, but again, many authors use throughput or throughput rate or other terms, and so we defined it in the glossary. Not altogether consistent across different sources, as you pointed out, but whether you use it or not. Now, by and large, when we're teaching at the level of KMP 1 or 2, then all we want people to understand is really this relationship between average delivery rate, average WIP and average lead time, and that they are linked together in a fairly simple way at the level of averages, and we can use that in terms of making assumptions about how the WIP in a system will evolve over time, and therefore what the impact on lead time or delivery rate, depending on which one, we can hold roughly constant. So that's the goal of it, and it's not more than that. When you look into it, say for doing process control tools and that sort of thing, you need to have a much deeper understanding of Little's Law and make sure it's consistent. I don't know if you're interested in this, but I had a long conversation with Dimitar Pikardiev and Pieter, I can't remember his surname, and they basically are pointing out, look, what you're talking about, Little's Law is approximately true. It's exactly true. It's a mathematical formulation, and the Little's Law is precise and exact, and it's always true. If you look into that, and there's a proof of Little's Law in one of the papers, what you find is that yes, it is true if you define arrival rate and queue length and what's the one I missed out? Wait time, as little does, and he makes certain ways of doing it. So you're chopping the two ends of a finite time period off. It's precisely true, and so is the Kanban formulation of little 4. It's precisely, absolutely true to as many decimal places as you like. If you're going from a period of 0 WIP to another period of 0 WIP, and then little is precisely true. If you're going from a period of a certain WIP to another period of certain WIP, that's where we need these assumptions around the work in progress is not aging, the approximate work in progress at the beginning and the end is the same, and then that is always true, and the degree to which those assumptions are not true will give you the error that you're going to get from looking at the data. Too much information really on that, but that is why those labels are done quite carefully, and why throughput, we're using throughput to mean both delivered items and discarded items. Now that's not necessarily a standard view, it's how we defined it and that's how we used it, and again other authors have different views on it. Again, I might modify that, I might recommend modifying that if we did a second edition, but at least it's defined, and with that definition it does make little or slightly more true. So you use throughput equals WIP over tip, and also those it rhymes, it's easier to understand, to remember. Okay, essential Kanban should be free and actively distributed. It is free. You can get a PDF and download it and so on. Obviously that doesn't help us in terms of doing second editions and so on if there is no revenue from it, but it is an important asset, and in due course I'm sure it will be updated, because it is it's a summary guide. It's not meant to be the readable everything explained book, but hopefully that essential element of the guts of Kanban, if you like, the essential elements of understanding Kanban are there in that book, and the references are just as important as the book, because that's where you get further explanation. So I hope you found that useful, and it's always good to discuss. Yeah, so I think your final paragraph there, in terms of the things that aren't fully consistent or the things that are developing, evolving over time, and that's the nature of the Kanban method. As you say, we're applying improved collaboratively, evolved experimentally on a meta level. That is what is happening in the community, and so Kanban will continue to evolve. And what is the Kanban method, and if you like, what is the essential bit of the Kanban method as opposed to all the other bits? And so I think what's happened, what's been published since EKT are things like the maturity model and the fitness for purpose book. Now, are those essential Kanban? We would say probably not essential Kanban. You need to understand essential Kanban in terms of get the best out of those further bodies of knowledge which are evolving as well. So yeah, thank you very much for your feedback, and continue to do so. At the moment there's no plans to do a second edition, and there's plenty of stuff that David and I would like to update, but then there's lots of other things that we'd like to do as well, and so that's a project for a future time. And thank you very much for your feedback. Do give me a call back or email me again, that's fine, and see you again.